Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this Geo tutorial. We're delighted today to be welcoming Charlotte Foster from the Field Studies Council. I'm Harriet from the GA. I'm going to be administrating the session today, so you might see me pop up in the comments at some points. Charlotte is a senior tutor FSC Flatford Mill in Suffolk, and she's worked for the FSC for nearly 6 years, before that being teacher in County Durham. As part of her role, Charlotte is involved in teaching all ages, but the majority of her groups tend to be A-level students, and she focuses on developing skills and knowledge for the independent investigation. She also develops GCSE geography resources and products for FSC. Hopefully you find the session today really useful. There is a handout that might be useful to refer to throughout the session, and I've popped the link to that in the comments, so it might be useful to have it open in the background. There's also a chat to the side, so if you have any questions throughout the session, please leave them there and Charlotte will answer them at the end. But please just remember to keep your comments related to the session and obviously polite and respectful. I'll pass over to Charlotte now to take over, and we'll pop back up at the end.
Okay, thank you, Harriet. Welcome everyone. Hello, I'm Charlotte, senior tutor at FSC Flatford Mill, as Harriet said, and also a member of the GA's special interest group for fieldwork and outdoor learning. So I'm really excited to be with you this afternoon to share, and a few of these tutorials actually, to share some ideas and hopefully inspiring ideas to help you with your own fieldwork, because that's something really close to my heart. So it's a great opportunity for you to do some meaningful and important geographical thinking and your own research. And today I'm here to help you make that research really relevant, hence our title here. We're enabling breadth, depth and relevance in the A-level independent investigation. I'll say now, apologies if I say NEA, it's just what I'm used to, but that's what we're talking about. Okay, so before we get going, just a bit of background for you. You'll need a notepad maybe with a pen to make notes with as we go. You may well have that handout there, and that's great if you do. That kind of has some images and diagrams in to help you sort of make sense of your ideas and your notes. So you can view these slides obviously as we're going as a slideshow, or in normal view if you want to add any comments over there or to make notes and things, paste images out of the slides, that sort of thing. Okay, so you've got that. It says answer questions as well. I do have a few bits as we go through the tutorial, sort of questions for you or tasks you might like to try. So if you want to add your ideas into the comments at those moments, that would be great, and we can kind of little national classroom here. Okay, if you do need to get these things, you've got a bit of time now, and I'm going to go through the aims for the session. So while we're here, we'll be making use of literature, geographical models and secondary data to inspire geographical thinking about a topic and location of interest. We'll be doing some worked examples to practice the skill of using those things to arrive at meaningful investigation aims and bring depth and relevance into each stage of the investigation. Finally, review how these elements fit into the route to inquiry and where they may help to support our investigation. So, as I'm going to bring out right at the start here, I've got that route to inquiry kind of diagram up, because we should really be seeing wider geographical theory or literature support the whole of the study, so that it's grounded in your geographical context and not just put that in the literature review to show your breadth of your study or something and then we never refer to it again. Okay, so it should be appearing throughout. I'm trying to remember that as we go. So why is it needed then, this breadth, depth and relevance all the way through your study? Well, first up, when you may have heard this in some of the previous tutorials, your independent investigation has to be specification linked. Okay, so it has to relate to a part of your specification, and you should be able to explain in detail how it does that. So that's one thing, and obviously this relevance is part of that. It will also though have wider geographical meaning and value to society, and hopefully it will have a degree of personal interest to you and be important for your own achievement. So you've got to do 3,000 to 4,000 odd words on this. It's worth 20% So it's well worth your full engagement, and it's really an opportunity for you to explore a topic that's relevant to you, meaningful, and close to your heart or important in your area. To kind of exemplify what I mean by that, by bringing in breadth, depth and relevance to your geographical research, we're going to try this in a little brief task. You might have with you a textbook, any geography textbook or magazine or something along those lines. I mean, I suppose a normal magazine might even work as well. And I'd like you to open up that book to a random page. So I've got a copy of Geography Review here, just because what I have handy. And I've opened it up to an article by Loretta Lees about gentrification. It's in the most recent version of Geography Review, it's February 2021. That's the most recent. So let's think about what that has to do with geography then, and that depth and relevance. What makes up the article? What information was needed in order to make that textbook page or make that article that's aiding our learning? Well, in here I've got some photos, 2 radial graphs of displacement data. Okay, don't know what they are. Showing where people have moved to as a result of gentrification. We've got 2 case studies of gentrification with all the evidence and the specifics that you would expect in a case study. But we've also got the wider geography, like the background of the concept of gentrification, research into how it can kind of almost blur into ghettoisation, or maybe be seen as urban regeneration, and the real life impacts of it. Now, all of that is interesting in its own right, but as a geographer, we're also, it's really critical to our understanding. Okay, so for the benefit of our geography knowledge and wider society, it's useful to know this sort of thing. It can directly impact on our lives, like prompt the positive multiplier in effect in an area, or it can create improvements in the built environments, that sort of thing. But obviously there's also the negative side in that we can see whole lives turned upside down by the displacement that happens when gentrification occurs in an area, and kind of the well-being impacts if your community is broken up, lack of affordable housing, that sort of thing. Take a moment now to consider for your own page or article what information was needed to create that article or that information, and can you link it to your own life? Even if you've picked something like, I don't know, volcanoes, it'll link somewhere, maybe politically or in terms of the global economy. Have a go. So hopefully, as we can see there, all geographical knowledge comes from research somewhere. In the real world, data has been collected about things that directly shape our lives or help us to understand the places that we use every day. So this independent investigation is your chance to do a meaningful piece of research and add to this massive geographical knowledge we have. And to do that, you need to be looking at something that is current or relevant or a new piece of information you're finding out. It should be something that you're interested in, because if you're interested and it matters to you, then it'll matter to other people in your community or wider. So we're going to explore through this kind of session how we can bring this depth, this breadth of study and this relevance into our independent investigations. Okay. The first way we're going to be doing that is looking at bringing in breadth in our study. So setting it in the wider context or the broader geographical thinking. It's where your study sits in the sphere of geography. Okay. And one way we can do this is through models. Now I've just picked a random model here, the demographic transition model, because it's probably something that many of you will have looked at some point. But I've done that to prompt you into answering, what is a geographical model? What do we mean by that? I'll give you a moment to think about it, but if you want to put any answers in the comments box, that'd be great to hear what you're thinking. What is a geographical model? might think of other models you've used as well, like maybe the Butler model or the Bradshaw model for rivers. Egan wheel, sustainability, quite common ones that come up. Okay, I'm afraid I can't tell if it's the delay on its streaming system or if no one knows the answer or isn't willing to put the answer. No matter. In essence, a geographical model is the generalization of a process or a geographical phenomenon from the real world. So the idea of the model is that it reduces complexity to help our understanding. Often in geography, they might have a spatial or temporal context, such as this one, obviously, over time with the DTM. And yeah, it helps us to understand that geography by simplifying it. So there are a range of ways that geographical models can be brought into our studies to help us with adding breadth. Let's have a look at a few of these here. First up, it sets our study, as I said, in a wider geographical context to show the breadth and the applicability of our independent investigation. There's also can also be useful in the study as it allows the possibility of testing the validity of a model in a locational context. So maybe by taking that general view of the geographical issue or event and seeing whether it applies in a certain place, maybe a location close to you or somewhere that you can access for your study, we might find out more. So we might find out a bit more information about when that model does or does not apply or other factors that influence it. It might help you in choosing locations for the investigation to help you decide, actually, I've got this whole massive thing to study, but where is something relevant? Where can I go where this will be relevant? It might help you select valid variables to guide your findings. So in a topic such as gentrification or, I don't know, inequality, they're really big topics, too unmanageable if we want to fit it within our 3,000 to 4,000 words. So it can help to select valid variables to measure. And finally, in our conclusions, if we can refer back to that model or use that model as our kind of guiding geography, it helps us to set the conclusions back in the broad context. So this is what I found, and this is why it's important or meaningful. Let's have a look at how that might work in a little worked example. And then at the end of that, I'll give you time to, again, apply it to your own area maybe and just have a practice of those skills. So let's say, for example, we've got the Health on the High Street report. There's the images in this PowerPoint, by the way, are generally linked to the website they came from. So if you want to look back over anything, you can do. So Health on the High Street was a report created to show how healthy our high streets are in terms of the facilities that are there. And it looked at about 70 cities or towns across the country and ranked them in order. So let's say that your high street was featured there and you're interested in how it came up with that value, whether that was important or not. So to help us understand this, we might start to use this model. It's the Barton and Grant model here, and it outlines the determinants of health and well-being in our cities. Okay. So using this model, it can help us to outline and recognise why health is important to us. So we might have seen something in the literature or in a report saying, oh, this is a thing in your town, but actually, why is that relevant? How can I bring breadth to my study? This model can help us to do that. It links, or it shows us that health links to a whole range of geographical concepts, such as these ones I've shown on the screen here. So this is why health might be important to us. Sustainable communities, the resilience of the community to sort of cope with changes, that sort of thing, or causality directly linked to the Health on the High Street report there, does one link to the other. So if we look in detail at this, we can see that there is real breadth in or applicability in the topic of health or health geographies. If we look in detail, we can see what sort of thing affects that in an area. You can see there in the different rings that the natural environment and the built environment might affect your health, all the way down to, as kind of a hierarchy, the people themselves and their age, their sex and hereditary factors. So that's featured on the model there. So of course, a model, the point of it is deliberately to reflect a very complex issue, but in a simplified way. So if we were trying to study all that, it would be pretty unmanageable. So even in one high street or one location, that would still be a lot of things to look at. So we can use the model to refine our thinking of actually what we can access and measure, either as primary or secondary data, in a manageable way. However, because we've used this kind of peer-assessed, this academic model to help us refine those ideas, we can ensure that they are valid factors, not just some random stuff we think might be connected, and that we're seeing valid links between our variables. So for example, here in this example, we might decide to focus on the impact of the built environment, as it's something we can measure directly, we can see it, but we can also back up those thoughts with accessible data from the next ring out, maybe things in the natural environment, pollution data maybe, it's a big data set, and activities, so the next ring down, that we can survey for to see if the activities possible as they're shaped by the built environment are conducive or perceived as conducive to health. So using the model, we can kind of pick out what variables we might study, and we'll ensure that they're valid because they come from this kind of wider source. So as you can see, we then have the broad, wider context of health geographies in our study. It's relevant to our location because we've got that literature basis, and we've got some valid but manageable variables to study. And we can return to this in the conclusions when we've done a whole report to set the scope of our findings, to say, you know, we've made these conclusions on health geographies in this town, but obviously we haven't addressed these other elements of the model. So it's a sort of conclusion to a certain extent, or tentative conclusion. So over to you then for a short while. I've got an activity here on the screen, and in your handouts there is sort of an outline of this activity just to structure your ideas. Obviously, if you're making notes just on normal paper, that's no problem. It's on the screen here for you as well. So I'd like you to try applying the Eden wheel as a model to prompt your thoughts to your own area. Which themes do you think are particularly important in your area? And does it link to any events or issues that are sort of contemporary or important at the moment? And maybe for one of those that you're most interested in, what questions could you ask to find out more? How could you use the Eden wheel to prompt a few thoughts of what you might study in your area? Again, if you'd like to share your thoughts in the comments of, you know, what's really relevant in your area, it's good to see where we come from. You don't need to state where you're from, of course, if you don't want to, but it's good to see the sorts of things we're recognising around the country. So do share your comments if you want to. I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a go at that. course, if you have any questions about the idea of models and using models in general, questions about that in the chat is also fine. That's kind of what findings you're making. So you've had a few minutes to do that there, guys. Are there any particular themes that are coming up as relevant in your area? Maybe links to any issues that are going on? I'd love to hear about it. Give you one more minute to either write or finish your thoughts on the even wheel. Okay, guys, so not feeling chatty today, which is fine. But hopefully you were able to recognise by making use of this as an example model, hopefully something that can be applied to any location, which is why I've chosen it for you just as a little tester task. You found a few themes that are relevant, maybe a particular interest to you. I think well connected is often something that's relevant to younger people if you can't drive yet. How do you access different services? Are the services suitable for everyone, or are they quite exclusive to a certain group? Something like that. So maybe that's a route you might find kind of into creating breadth in your independent investigation. So that's the breadth kind of covered. What about the other elements? We're next going to be moving on to adding depth or bringing depth to your investigation using secondary data. So I suspect I won't get many answers, but what do we mean by secondary data? Hopefully you know. And when might we use them? So secondary data, how to think about that there, are information that was collected by someone other than you or other than the researcher for different research purposes, but relevant to us or important to us as it may be relevant to our study and it can help with our findings and link with our findings. We can therefore use it to add depth to our studies, as it's usually a big data set such as the census, or maybe data that tells us about past trends, so it might be quite a small information set but relevant to our location and past time or something. Or it might be information that we can't easily get as primary data, such as on sensitive topics like income that we wouldn't want to necessarily ask about, or it wouldn't be very easily accessible as a primary data source. So let's overview those points then. Using secondary data allows us to explore a location really thoroughly but efficiently to kind of shape and refine our studies focus. So we can maybe have access to a whole town, but as Bob mentioned in his first tutorial, that's not the sort of area we're looking at. That's unmanageable. It's too much to try and assess. But in your research at the initial stages, you can explore a whole town, late data from a whole town or a whole area, a whole landscape, maybe through land use data or a whole river catchment or something, looking at, I don't know, water security. And then use that big data set to refine down and shape actually what is interesting in this area and what can I focus on. It also helps us with less accessible data, as I said, it can be sensitive data, and kind of to add more depth or more information to our findings. Okay, so there might be something we can ask about that we don't mind asking about, such as what people perceive as adequate services in the area or inadequate services, or adequate connectivity, transport links, that sort of thing. But we might not want to ask them more personal or more sensitive questions about inequalities, deprivation, quality of life, something like that. So it's quite useful for that. As I say, it's usually big data. Big data sets mean increased reliability and so increased accuracy, which is really important to kind of back up or validate and maybe triangulate against if we can only manage a fairly small data set or a relatively small data set from our own sampling for primary data. So that's pretty useful. It can help us, talking of sampling, select a valid sampling strategy. If we can look across a whole area, how a variable changes or where there are important features might guide us towards a certain sampling strategy. I'll come to an example of that in a second. It can help us select valid variables, again, just like the models did. It might tell us actually what's really going on here, what's worth studying, and actually what will just give us kind of mediocre results aren't really very interesting. And again, at the final part, it can allow us comment on the extent of our conclusions. So we've drawn conclusions from our own data set, we've analysed them, but actually if we look at that against the bigger backdrop of secondary data, are we still finding those same conclusions, or do we think we've missed something out for whatever reason? It could be temporal, spatial sampling, whatever it might be. So let's look at this one again as a worked example, just to show you what I mean by some of those bullet points. Here is a map from Good City Life. All the boxes down the bottom are hyperlinked, so you can go and look at this data if you want to afterwards. So this is, yeah, all secondary data that we're looking at. Linking back to our earlier idea of health geographies, we use the model to help with accessible, measurable data. But lots of health information is sensitive and or linked to broad landscape scale factors, so it's harder to get hold of and work out what's going on. So in this case, secondary data might give depth to our study as we can look further into the issue. Might either be at the planning stage when we're deciding what to look at, or as actual data that we're using and analysing in the main body of our work. So this map is showing the brightest arrows are where people are well off but unhealthy, and it looks at the incidence of disease as a result of that as well. So that may be not what we'd expect, that well off people are less healthy. You know, they should be able to afford access to good healthcare, good fitness sort of facilities, good quality food, etc. So why might that be? That might be a question that's thrown up from this map. Well, we can see that they tend to be on the outskirts of London, this is where this data is from, on the outskirts of London, the outer kind of wards. So is it because they're commuting and they don't have time, they're just grabbing something to eat in the city rather than spending time cooking at home? Is it because maybe they're well off, they might be sort of professionals or younger professionals, so they might be living in shared houses and not have very good access to cooking facilities? Is it a local influence, like the help on the high streets? Are there, takeaways all over the place, providing a temptation? Or is it the built environment just isn't conducive to activity and to walking and to cycling and stuff, especially if they're on the outskirts and they work in the city? Who knows? All of those could be really interesting kind of routes to study, but these are landscape scale findings, so it's too big to study as a whole. But it is valuable in that we've found some interesting geographies there, and can then maybe narrow down to one of those areas if we had kind of logistical access to it to find out more and maybe follow up one of those kind of routes to inquiry. Another really useful large data set or secondary data set is the IMD, the Index of Multiple Deprivation. And I've just put the key up there so that you can understand the maps that are about to come up. As you can see, the darkest blue is shows that area, that LSOA, lower super output area, so it's an area of the census, is among the 10% most deprived areas in the country, and the lightest kind of bluey yellowy colour is within the 10% least deprived in the country. Okay, so this is a map of Colchester, and it's just at the moment showing the general IMD score, so the areas of Colchester that are most or least deprived. Fine, interesting. We can see at this stage that there is some variation, but it doesn't really help us narrow down what we're looking at. If we were trying to look at deprivation or inequalities in Colchester, what would we look at? Well, the great thing about the IMD is that you can split out the categories that it's made up of 7 different categories. So, for example, here we've got health deprivation factors, and again, you can see there's some variation, but it's fairly mixed across the city. Environmentally, that's much more kind of dichotomized, if you like. There are some areas that are quite deprived environmentally. Most of the outskirts are within the least deprived. So that really sharp contrast is quite interesting. What's going on there? Does that feed into the health geographies? Who knows? We might go on to study it. Here we've got crime, and again, that's kind of the opposite. A lot more of Colchester appears to be among the more deprived areas in the country. So why might that be coming around? So you can see that you're using the IMD here to search out some variables that are interesting in your area, and maybe you could then focus down from that on what you'd want to look at. Once you've found those large areas, you might then choose to bring in another data set. This is from DataShine, it's the census data, and you can see that, well, as I'm sure you know, the census has loads of different parameters that you can explore, and maybe would help you to refine further and start to explain why some of those patterns come about. And this is all helping you to get a good amount of depth. So instead of quite a vague inquiry title for your independent investigation, you can really focus down at the outset on a deep and meaningful study that you want to undertake, that you've kind of already got a bit of evidence for, that there's something going on and it's worth investigating. So here, for example, again, you've got the key up there to show you what the maps mean. This is a map for general health, and it's showing bad health. So really, there's only a few patches within Colchester where more than a third of the people are reporting bad health. That's pretty good. But then the sort of things you can do by picking from that range of parameters, you can explore why might that be. So, is it because there are a lot of elderly people there? Maybe they would be more likely to report poor health. Well, no, not really, because this map of retired people in terms of economic activity doesn't really match up with that initial pattern. You know, you can go into everything. Is it their heating? Is that causing breathing problems or something? Maybe people with storage heaters might find it harder to heat their homes efficiently through the day. Who knows? But you can explore all sorts of things, including tenure as well, or overcrowding, how many people are in the area. Or is it their income, their access to improving elements of their health? So does it match well with who has a professional occupation, such as shown in this map? To a certain extent, I think this is the best map. But obviously you would be doing your own search, you'd have your own geographical ideas of why these patterns might be coming around, and secondary data can help you really quickly check those out to see what is going on in an area. And then obviously you can make use of that as you go through your study to kind of validate or support your findings at a wider scale. So we've had a little look there at what we can do. The great thing is that we can pick out interesting factors from massive topics. And as we've just seen a few examples there, what I'd like you to maybe do is have a go at, with either your own ideas at matching where we can use secondary data within the route to inquiry. So you have a little diagram of this on your handout if you're using it, or if not, you can just list it as kind of the investigation sequence. Where would secondary data help us within an investigation? You should be able to match it, as I said at the start, to a number of the different stages. It's not just something that's helping us in the outline or in the literature review we want, or indeed in the data presentation where we're trying to back up our own data by getting a bit more. Where can it help us? So I'll give you a few moments to annotate around the edge of your route to inquiry and see what you can come up with. How does secondary data support the different stages of the route to inquiry? Again, if you'd like to share your ideas in the comments, feel free. Okay, so you've had a bit of time there. Hopefully you've got some good ideas of how that secondary data can really help support the depth through the whole investigation. Just a couple of ideas that may be a bit less obvious. Maybe in the conclusions, you can use big data or maybe temporal data, as in data from a previous time or a different season to your study, to show the extent that your findings are applicable. Sort of maybe carbon data at different times of year, or coastal data in winter when it's stormier, something like that might be relevant to show the extent to which your findings kind of apply. Or in the data presentation, yes, you might supplement your data with further secondary data, but secondary data might also be things like maps. So you could put other data alongside your data, or your data on different types of maps to make more of the context of your findings and your primary data. So it really can be used all the way through to bring depth and relevance to your study. We'll move on from this section to our last kind of big area, which is the relevance from breadth and depth. We're looking at the relevance that we can bring to our study using literature. So a question for all of you, if you want to answer it. What do we mean by literature, and how can it help us, again, through that process? Give you a couple of minutes to have a think about it. So when we're talking about literature in your study, it refers to any printed material, really, which can be a source of information. So the classic go-to is sort of books, articles about things, but it also might include primary sources of data like emails or planning documents, or newspapers or social media even. And maybe at the moment with kind of restricted access to people, social media might be quite a big source of literature to you. So we'll look at how it can help us in our studies, and you might bring in ideas from the first tutorial if you saw it as well, with Bob's ideas of what's in the news and kind of getting an idea for your NEA. So what is in the news? I like to refer to this idea as being a bit like fish and chip paper. If you're aware, back in the very olden days, they used to wrap fish and chips in old newspapers. And so the idea being that, you know, that was yesterday's news, and then you have your layers of wrapping around your fish and chips. Your first one might be from the local area, and then building up through the layers. So the next wrapper might be regional, national, global. And the idea is that you're trying to see the importance of your issue of study or the sphere of influence of your location by seeing how far out through those layers of information or those scales of information your issue or location extends. Let's have an example of this to show you what I mean. So down here, this is a local example to me. I live in Suffolk, and this is a newspaper article from Thurston, which is kind of a large village in Suffolk. And the local news item that's there, and it's definitely not just restricted to Thurston, is that planning has been granted for a new sports development and some other buildings, despite the conservation concerns. So the local community are not all completely happy with this. They're concerned about the environmental impacts it will have. Okay, well, that's fair enough. So this is our local event or issue or phenomena. It's maybe important to you, and if it's important to you, as I say, it'll be important to others. But how important? We can use this method to work out how important our local thing is in the literature, and therefore what is the scale of relevance it has to wider society, nationally, even globally. So your job would be then to look at wider newspaper articles or wider literature to see if your location or your issue appears wider in the news. Now the likelihood is that a smallish location such as Thurston might not be appearing in regional or international news, because as I say, this kind of planning issues are big news all over the place. That doesn't matter. What about the issue? Is planning and conservation issues featured in the wider news? Well, yes, it is. So then you can start to build up your layers. So featured at the regional or national level, for example, I found an article on the BBC News, the government pledges more affordable homes. So that's kind of the positive side. They want planning permission granted for more homes in kind of popular areas where people want to live, especially affordable ones, kind of addressing those wider ideas of inequality and community resilience. In the East Anglian, so a regional paper, we see there are environmental concerns over development of wind farms and Sizewell C, which is a nuclear power station development on the Suffolk coast. So again, we're seeing those environmental concerns shown wider as well. So actually, if we did research this particular example in Thurston, we would be addressing issues and finding out more geography about issues that are important at a wider scale as well. Regional, national, what about any bigger? What about international? Yes. In an article from The Guardian there, we can see that radical action is needed to combat increasing rates of environmental damage to water sources, land, biodiversity, and marine life. So this small conservation concern in Suffolk, who are concerned about red-listed species such as skylarks, type of bird, and the kind of rural environment there, we're seeing that bigger. Actually, this environmental degradation is a bigger issue. But on the other hand, in the RTE paper, it's reported that mental health of Europe's teens is on the decline, maybe as a result of lack of nature connection or lack of outside space and space for exercise. Well, this planning is for leisure and exercise facilities, so surely that's a good thing. So we're finding the balance all the way through. It's quite interesting. Finally, at our largest scale, we're looking at the academic or theoretical level. So how does this issue link to wider geography? Well, There's still some research going on. Derby University and the Wildlife Trusts were researching again that nature connection linked to health. But we're also seeing wider geographical concepts coming up, like the idea of urban sprawl, inequality in housing, ecosystem balance and connectivity, and the idea of a sense of place, so can Thurston preserve its identity as this sort of rural village and small community if it's being expanded all the time, that sort of thing. So by looking at this scaled approach, if you like, of seeing what's in the literature, as we move up the scales, you've probably noticed that we're coming across more and more general literature. So it might be we start with primary literature, like the planning documents, through secondary, like the journals or newspapers linked to the topic. But at the top level, we're seeing more general literature there, which should be peer reviewed or based on big data sets. So it's a really reliable geographical context in which this issue is set. And that is a great basis for your independent investigation. We can see that the value and meaning in our study topic is shared across the different levels. And ideally, you check for that and highlight that really near the start of your investigation. In fact, on your proposal forms, you'd have to outline why this is important or why it's interesting geographically and that sort of thing. Having said that, it's not just that you're researching a known phenomena. So, for example, succession in ecosystems, we know that exists. We don't need more proof of it. What you need to research is an issue or something interesting about that. So, for example, on your sand dunes, salt marsh, whatever it might be, is it the impact of trampling, new conservation practice, a pollution problem, maybe, I don't know, boats in a new harbour nearby are causing environmental damage. Whatever it might be, you need something of value in it, and therefore it's a good place to start with this kind of local issue or something that's locally interesting to you that's going on in your life, and that you would therefore be interested in following up and seeing how relevant that is to wider society. So bearing in mind the importance and relevance of literature there, where can we find it where it's accessible? And I know from personal experience and the experiences the students have taught, it is quite difficult at this level to find access to literature because you don't have the big libraries that universities do and that sort of thing. But there are things out there. There's a few listed here: geofact sheets, magazines like Geographical Review, if you access that, or your school might have a subscription that you can borrow some from at the geography cupboard. On the GA website, they have a list of recommended reading. So there's a link to that one there, you can follow that. Various journals, some of which allow you free access. Subscription magazines as well. It might be again that your school has a small subscription, or you can pay a small subscription to access just a few articles, and some have free articles. There's ideas listed there, New Scientist, The Economist. The conversation is quite good because that is free, freely accessible, and it's sort of articles written by academics. And there's usually quite a lot relating to geography on there. So there are some options for you. You can have a go at visiting those if you wish. Just to, again, practice those kind of ideas, I've got a short activity for you here. So using some of this series of articles, they are, again, linked if you want to kind of access them and go to them. Have a go at identifying themes that link across the scales here. So which one can you identify, or which ones can you identify as the largest scale kind of academic theory, and how do they scale in to something that's happening in a local area? It might be that you can start with something linked to carbon capture, carbon footprint, climate change, something like that in your local area, and scale outwards. Who knows? Have a go. So yeah, an opportunity for physical or human kind of thoughts and inquiry here. I'll give you a moment to have a go at that task. The comments box is still there for any questions or thoughts. Okay. Hopefully you've found that process useful or inspiring. You think that would be maybe an accessible structure you could work through to approach your own ideas, your own independent investigation. And again, there's always throughout this kind of a PowerPoint which you have access to, there are lots of excellent, Simon. Oh, there you go. I know who you are. Yeah, really good that you can see examples that should be applicable to your local area, even if, like Simon, it doesn't necessarily apply to your own local area from these examples. But yeah, there's lots of literature out there that can apply to your area, and you can sort of build up through the scales to show its relevance in the literature and really get that context to your study. So just moving on, I've got a few final thoughts on using literature in your studies. First up, sources of bias. Now, this literature will come from, whatever you use, will come from somewhere. And it's not always easy to tell whether it's biased information. As I say, if it's an academic source, then it almost certainly has been peer reviewed, and you can generally tell by the size of the data set whether that's likely to be an accurate or representative view of whatever it's talking about. But actually, biased information is not always a bad thing. If we're looking particularly at human topics that relate directly to people or communities, that qualitative overview is what we want, and their personal stories are really interesting. It doesn't matter if they're biased and they just come from one person, or if only one person expresses that particular opinion or perception. You know, that's important to them, and there's a story behind that. So sometimes that specificity within qualitative data is really useful, and that bias is useful to us, therefore. But it is important that you recognise bias if it's there. You know, bring it out in your evaluation or in your conclusions when you're weighing up the strength of those conclusions, and that'll be okay. Okay, so sometimes it can service us. Referencing is there because you will need to create a reference list or a bibliography or something for your independent investigation. And there are loads of different ways of referencing. Harvard's a really common system, but there'll be information online, all of this, to do that. It's just a note that because I've talked about a lot of other sources of information to bring into your independent investigation today, you will need to reference it and give credit to where it came from. The final point there is about adaptation. So when you're reading about examples that come from another place and you're trying to apply it to your place, 2 words of caution. One, is it a valid comparison, or is it valid to use that example of something in your area? So don't make too broad a comparison or unreliable comparison. But also the positive side of that is you can adapt the techniques, the methods, the information you find in the literature or in models and in secondary data to fit your approach. So maybe you might change some approaches to an index that shows you something, or adapt the different variables that they look at. So you can get ideas from the literature and sort of adapt it to your area or your location that you're studying. So there's a few ideas of making use of and playing around with literature just there. So you've done all this research, that's great, but what you'll now need to do is come up with some form of aim, title, hypotheses for your investigation. And so I just wanted to tag on to the end of this tutorial, what makes a good question for your independent investigation? Well, we've mentioned your level of interest. That's really important so you can stick at it and really engage with it. It should be of a manageable scale, the question. It should be logistically and ethically feasible. So you don't want to, you want to be able to get your data, and you don't want that data to impact negatively on anyone else or the environment. And you'll need to put a kind of ethical considerations section in your investigation. I mentioned at the start it should be spec linked and have that geographical context, and hopefully by following some of these you'll be able to do that. It allows you to explore new ideas, not just regurgitating something of interest going on. And finally, your question is good if it has purpose, such as maybe you're making a judgment, to what extent, how far, or so on, or putting in a comparison. But as I said earlier, make sure it's a legitimate comparison, not comparing two completely random areas. And they're good guidelines. And one way you might like to do that is by using something like this question matrix. So as you're reading through and doing your research, maybe consider using a question matrix like this to help you track your ideas and questions that are coming up in your mind as you read through things and look at different models and stuff. You'll notice that as you move towards the bottom right, the questions get more sophisticated, more towards the sort of thing you'd be looking at in an NEA, in event investigation, but it'll build up as your thinking develops as you get through your research. So hopefully you feel we've covered this array of aims for the session, but do take a look now, and if there's anything you are still unsure about, just note it down so that you can either ask your teacher or do your own bit of research into that element. And to help you with that, we'll leave you with these links here. So these are links either from the awarding organisations or from the GA and the FSC, with things that might either guide your teachers, some of them, or guide you as students to further reading and further information to help you with any of those points. Okay, so hopefully you found it really helpful, and I'll stay around if there are any further questions. But thank you so much. Best of luck with your independent investigations, and most of all, enjoy it. Enjoy your own bit of research.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for presenting that today. I found it really useful, and I hope all the students found it useful as well. For anyone watching live, if you want to go back through the session again to do some of those activities, just click on the same link again and a recording will be available for you to watch again. Do remember that there's a link in the video description as well to the PowerPoint and the handout. So if you download those, you can click on all the links and be able to follow up on the further reading. But yeah, thank you for everyone for attending today, and we hope to see you again for the next one.